Hello and welcome back to ATA's EconChat. I am your host, John Humphreys, and joining me, as I was about to say as always, but I should say as often, is Tunny. Gene, how you doing?
Good, thanks, John. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Another beautiful day in paradise. So everyone, if you're watching this at home, hopefully watching this live with us, we do this live stream live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Queensland time, 8 p.m. New South Wales and Victoria. And the rest of the states can work it out themselves. We do this casual and interactive. What do I mean? Casual, I mean this is unscripted. I don't know most of what Gene's going to say, but I'll respond to it. He doesn't know most of what I'm going to say, but I'm sure he'll find a way to agree, disagree, or come up with something. And interactive as in you'll be watching this through YouTube or Facebook. If you put the comments in, we are watching the comments as they come in. Speaking of which, I should be following them. There you go. We are watching the comments as they come in. So please write a comment, say hello. If you disagree, tell us you disagree. Put in questions, criticisms, comments, anything else starting with K. And we're happy to get distracted. We have a few things we plan on touching on today. But if you ask a question that's more interesting than what we had planned, then I'm happy to get distracted and follow down whatever rabbit hole could come up. So speaking of following us on Facebook and YouTube, you could be following us either at my personal page, John Humphreys, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance page, or the Good Source. Whichever one you're on, please give us a like, please give us a follow, please give it a share. And then if you have a bit of time, go to the other ones. Please go to Australian Taxpayers Alliance and John Humphreys' YouTube page and give us a follow. So I see we've got the debate going strong already, Steve. I also disagree, which means we are in furious agreement about how much we disagree. I don't know how that works exactly, but thank you all for coming along and joining us. So yes, jumping in. We like to keep people up to date with whatever the latest news and economic data floating around the country is. There's been a few data points come in. Most obviously today, the Reserve Bank of Australia announced that they are putting interest rates up by another 25 basis points. What does that mean? 25 basis points, that sounds weird. It just means 0.25%. Right, that's just the way monetary economics boffins talk. But 25 basis points is 0.25%, which takes the cash rate up to 3.6%. It was 0.1% 11 months ago. I think that's right, wasn't it? 11 months ago, Gene?
Well, in April, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
0.1 up to 3.6. That's been 11 consecutive rate rises. So that's the news from today. There's not a lot more commentary I could add. Every month we've noted the interest rate rise. Every time I've said the same thing. While inflation is high, raising the interest rates does make sense. It hurts. It hurts me. It hurts many people listening. It's not clear if there is another alternative, more responsible way to go while inflation is this high. There were policy mistakes, but I would argue those policy mistakes came earlier, years ago, when interest rates were kept too low for too long, which created this inflation. And now we're in a mess. And now we have to take the responsible decisions to clean it up, which unfortunately for me and many people listening, means higher interest rates. Although I do think, and I'm not alone on this, I do think that we are starting to see the end of this tightening phase of monetary policy. So hopefully the end is in sight. You got anything on that, Gene?
I'd say it's hard to tell. I mean, one of the things that's been said internationally is that rates are going to be higher for longer. And, Paul Krugman's concerned now. He thinks that, this inflation that they've got in the US is sticky and, rates will have to stay high for longer over there than they anticipated. And we've got Rubini, Dr. Doom. He's warning of stagflation because he thinks that the central banks, they'll lift them, they'll keep lifting them, but he thinks they may not be able to lift them enough to really grind the inflation out of the system. The problem is people might be coming to expect inflation. It's getting built into expectations, and therefore what will end up happening is that they'll lift the rates to a level and then they'll crash the economy, and we could end up with this stagflation. So that's one of the things that people internationally are talking about at the moment. I'm not sure whether we'll just how... Well, go ahead.
No, it is a good point. People have talked about it. It's one of the reasons why, and I think we've discussed it previously on EconChat. It's one of the reasons why when inflation kicked in and the RBA suddenly discovered that they were supposed to be responsible, I think they should have increased rates sharper. I think they should have gone harder early on. And by going harder early on, hopefully put an immediate cap on that inflation to reduce the likelihood that inflation expectations kick in. But now they didn't take that advice. At this point, I think it wouldn't make sense to start going to 50 basis points jumps. So I think we're stuck on this path now, a bit of path dependence. Look, I don't think we're going to get stagflation. I hope we don't. The concern is if the RBA had lost their nerve a few months ago and stopped increasing rates, I think then it was a very real risk, because I think the economy is going to come off this year anyway. But if the RBA had lost their nerve, we would have had ongoing inflation while the economy started to slow down, and that would have really created a difficult situation. So I think they did the right thing to hold their nerve and keep increasing rates. In my opinion, I think they're on track to get inflation under control. And then I do think we're going to see stagnation. I do think we're going to see a recession, but hopefully not stagflation. That's my guess. Everyone can throw it in my face in 6 months' time when we see what actually happens. But that's my best take. Speaking of which, speaking of inflation expectations, we did have the latest CPI data. Now, of course, we should be cautioned not to overinterpret each piece of monthly CPI data that does come out monthly, and you really do need to see a trend. But in a little bit of good news, the CPI inflation, right, the consumer price index, measuring how much a bundle of goods that consumers on average or sometimes buy, and how much that price changes. Inflation, the increase in CPI had been going up quite strongly. It was up to 8.4%, 8.4 in the last month. In the year up to December, it's now down to 7.4. So we have seen the latest inflation data show what could be the inflation trend capping out, which goes directly to the question here from Steve Burkett. Do you think inflation is plateauing? If you take this data at face value, which of course, caveat, it's a bit too early. We would like to see a trend. But if you take this data at face value, then yes, it does look like inflation is plateauing out. Would you agree with that?
Oh, possibly. I mean, I'm reluctant to make any forecasts here. I mean, given particularly the data we're going to be chatting about in several moments on rents. So rents have really been accelerating these first few months of 2023, and I think we see it at the supermarket, just how much prices are going up. Look, it'd be nice if it has plateaued, but again, you said yourself, John, you don't want to overinterpret one data point. I really don't know. I am concerned that there could be some persistence in inflation now, and they could be over optimistic about just how. I mean, I think the cash rate, maybe it has to go up even further. So the major banks are forecasting it's only going to get up to 4.1%. So there'll be another two 25 basis point increases. But then someone like Michael Knox's forecasting it's going to get up to nearly 5%. But because he thinks that there is still a lot of resilience in the economy and inflation's going to be hard to control, just too hard to forecast at the moment.
It is a mug's game making forecasts, which is why you are the smarter commentator of the two of us. I foolishly put myself on the line. You've escaped it. Look, if the inflation is persistent and the RBA loses their nerve, then we could be in for sustained inflation. So far, the RBA has indicated that they understand their mandate. So I'm hopeful that they follow through on that. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt for the moment, and I'm hopeful that this is the plateauing of inflation. Look, another thing to note in terms of the impact of this monetary policy, a lot of home loans are coming off a fixed rate over the coming months, and that's going to be another implicit piece of tightening when that kicks in as well. So but anyway, we're prognosticating. We don't know the answer. But there you go. The graph that you see in front of you, by the way, is the CPI for Australia, and you can see there the significant increase in inflation we've had over the last more than a year. And you can see what looks like, we hope, there's only one data point of down there, but that's the hopeful size. So we'll see how that one plays out. So there's one other, I'll keep this up here and let's switch.
The other thing too, John, is that's their experimental indicator, isn't it? So it's not the full set of products, the goods and services that go into CPI. So there'd be some caveat that the ABS has there about the fact it's monthly, and just be careful in reading too much into it.
So the all groups monthly CPI indicator. Look, we've both given that caveat. It's a good one. We've got to wait a few more months to be confident in the trend, but it is a glimmer of hope. Now, the other piece of data that came out recently is the national accounts. That's the big data dump 4 times a year, once every quarter, where we get to look at the trajectory of the economy. The headline here is GDP rose in nominal terms by 2.1%. So 2.1% growth, but that doesn't factor in price increase. So once you factor in the price increases, then that's now what we call the real economic growth. Like real means adjusted for prices. Once you factor in the price increase, then the real GDP growth was 0.5%, and that's the number that has been reported over the last week in terms of the economic growth. The thing that I would add here, this is my big bugbear about how national accounts are reported. This is I'll see if I can get that data up here. This is the GDP number that's talked about. Here it is, that's 0.5. You'll notice what I think is a far more relevant number is GDP per capita. If GDP is supposed to be a measure of the success of the economy, if it goes up by 0.5, but that's just because the population went up by 0.5, then nothing's really changed for the people. Right? If you have 2 people with 2 people share 1 pizza, or 4 people share 2 pizzas, they're still getting the same number of slices. Right? So I think what matters here is looking at the GDP per capita, and you'll note here, GDP per capita went up by 0. I don't know if everyone can see that easily at home, but it's just a dash, which means 0. Now, I scratched a bit more into this data. It actually mildly went down. So that was a negative movement. GDP per capita mildly went down in the last quarter. I would say it's GDP per capita that matters. This is potentially the start of a recession. If we have 2 quarters of negative per capita growth, I will be calling that a per capita recession. And we could be at the start of that. You'll see the quarter before that, per capita only went up 0.1, basically stagnating, and now down like minus roughly 0. So the economy, I would argue, is already stagnating and potentially showing the start of a recession. I'd also note, by the way, that the economy grew per capita by 0 at the same time as people are working more. This is an increase in hours worked, so that the GDP per hours worked, which is a good indicator of the productivity in our country, the GDP per hours worked decreased by 1.4%. Let's see, is that in here? Here it is. Productivity, GDP per hours worked, negative 1.4%, which is a worry. I'd also note that the way GDP is normally calculated, they unpack it, consumption, government spending, net exports. I would say the healthiest part of that when you unpack it is investment. Investment in the last quarter went down 1.4%. So I have been a bit of a doomsayer in terms of where I think the economy is trending over this year. And it's a dangerous thing to make predictions, of course, because then you can all throw it in my face in 6 months' time. But I think so far this data suggests our economy is stagnating at best, and we could be at the cusp of a recession. What do you make of that, Jim?
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I think we are certainly slowing down. I mean, it'll be a downturn of some kind. Whether you label something a recession or not is always controversial, and there'll be debate over the appropriateness of the 2 negative quarters definition. And I'm sure there'll be a debate on if we do have the GDP per capita recession, then we'll have a lot of commentary on that. But yeah, definitely there'll be a slowdown, and you're starting to, I think, just anecdotally, you're starting to hear about it. People with mortgages, and like you mentioned, all the fixed rate, this mortgage cliff they're talking about, But people on variable rates, they're already paying more, and nearly $1,000 or around $1,000 a month more, depending on the size of the mortgage and the term. So, and what people are doing is they're cutting back on discretionary spending. They're cutting, maybe they're cancelling Netflix. Well, I mean, that's not a loss to the Australian economy, but they might not be going, spending on takeaway. Maybe they're taking fewer holidays, etc. So, yeah, I mean, we're certainly going to be seeing it. That's for sure.
Just a comment on that, like what I find remarkable, it's the reason I keep stressing it, is if we do have a per capita recession, I suspect you won't hear all about it. The media seems spectacularly uninterested in reporting on the data point that I think is significantly more important. If economic data is supposed to give us an indication of the quality of our life, and if it's not that, then why are we looking at it? Then I think the per capita data is more important. And yet you will find not many economists other than us, Gene, will be stressing it, which is one of my bugbears. It's the reason I'll keep, shaking my fist at the clouds. So that's, hopefully they will. Hopefully they will listen to us by then and notice. And by the way, there didn't used to be a debate about whether 2 negative quarters was a recession. That only became a debate because the Biden administration in America suffered 2 quarters of negative growth and decided to change the definition, which is very cheeky. But like one last thing I wanted to show in the national accounts, and this is not directly comparable because with the state data, we're not factoring in a few different data points. But looking at the domestic final demand split up by states, you'll see here a lot of negative numbers. So this is one of the things I've talked about before. Averages can be misleading. They can be very useful. Don't throw them away. But averages can hide some very different stories that are going on under the surface. My throwaway line is if you have one hand in the fire and one hand in the freezer, your average temperature might be nice, but you are not comfortable, right? That's hiding the truth of your situation. And you can see here, some of these states, Queensland, South Australia, are already seeing their economy going backwards, while other states are doing a little better. Victoria here bouncing back from their previous bad numbers. So look, again, you shouldn't overinterpret this, but it is worthwhile remembering that the Australian data doesn't impact all the states equally. Of course it doesn't. All right, I think that's...
Did you notice...
Go ahead.
Yeah. Did you notice, I thought Tim made an interesting point in the comments. Jobs are still strong, though, so I think he's pointing out the fact that job vacancies have been very high, and I mean, they have started to come off, but they're still been at very high levels. So, yeah... Well, I guess we have to.
What do you make of that? What is your best interpretation?
I think if the economy's slowing, the job market's going to slow at the same time. We just may not have seen it in the data yet. I mean, we chatted about last month's or the January labour force data, didn't we, last month? And the unemployment rate is increasing. There was some debate about whether, to what extent that reflected people waiting for a job to start in February. But look, I think we'll start to see the labour market slow over this year. It's just that we haven't seen it in the data yet, or maybe anecdote. I don't know what people out there are experiencing, but I mean, my sense is that as the economy slows, the labour market almost certainly will too.
Look, I agree. I think the unemployment data is going to get worse. I don't think we're alone there as well. I think that's the standard expectation for the coming year, but there is still an anomaly here wrapped in Tim's comment, and that is unemployment has been remarkably low at a period of time where growth hasn't been great. So that does need to be unpacked. That does need to be explained. I agree, unemployment rates are expected to increase, but that still doesn't answer the question of how did they get so low? And I'd say that the two leading contenders to explain that is one is during the COVID lockdowns, which were a disgrace, but put that aside for now, that did significantly decrease the number of people coming into the country. So we just had less competition, and that drives up, that increases the demand for the remaining Australian labour force. So this is an interesting experiment, a natural experiment in the impact of immigration on unemployment. So I think that's part of it. Another part, which I think is because the first one I mentioned, lots of people have made that observation. The second one, I think fewer people have made this observation, that in the last couple of years, we've seen a significant change in the relative desirability of labor versus capital. So from a business perspective, you invest in capital, you invest in labor, other things as well, but let's just shorten it down to those two things. To some degree, they can be substitutes, right? You could have a person actually scanning your groceries at the supermarket, or you could have a machine do it, right? So we've seen there's lots of examples where capital and labor can be substitutes. If the price of capital has been going up, and it has been, and the price of labor has not been going up much, and it hasn't been, it does make sense that businesses would be shifting from capital to labor. They would be increasing their demand for labor because the relative price of labor from their perspective has gone down. And we've seen over the last couple of years, wages, real wages, adjusted for prices, have decreased, right? So we have seen a decrease in real wages. Just logically there, supply and demand, you would expect to see, if there was a decrease in real wages, there to be an increase in demand for labor in the labor market, and therefore higher employment, lower unemployment. So that's, I think, another part of the explanation. It's at this point, I think, a little bit hard to disentangle those two potential explanations. So I don't know which one's stronger. It'll be interesting to see whether some researchers are able to unpack that in the coming years. We had a few other comments quickly coming in before we jump. So we're just going to go down to the format of these discussions. We discuss the latest data as we have been. And then instead of having two different rants, we're just going to have one rant. So that's the new format for these discussions. It's going to be Gene's rant. That's coming up in a second. Just before we jump into that, let's just have a look at the comments coming in and see if there's some interesting jumping off points. James Brown says, aren't the banks to blame for all of this because they lent money to people who couldn't afford to pay it back if the rates rise? Do you want to take a stab at this, Gene? Do you have an instinctive response?
Well, I think they were encouraged to do a lot of this lending by the Reserve Bank of Australia, and by the Reserve Bank of Australia lowering the cash rate to 0.1%, and then that term funding facility which provided cheap finance to banks, that really has encouraged the banks. I mean, the banks are going to, they're going to try and make money, and I know it's popular to bash the banks, and look, I mean, maybe they have lent excessively. From their point of view, as long as there's enough of as long as the value of the houses, there's no negative equity, as long as the housing market doesn't totally crash, they'll end up with all of these houses on their balance sheets when they foreclose. So that's what's going to happen. So is it reckless? Possibly. I'd blame the Reserve Bank of Australia more than the banks, which are simply responding to the signal, the loosened monetary conditions from the central bank.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think the Reserve Bank gets the blame for having rates too low for too long. I've got to say, I haven't seen evidence that the bank's lending has been ridiculously out of whack with people's capacity to repay. I mean, there hasn't been, as of yet, we may be shown to be wrong, but as of yet, there hasn't been an intolerably high, from the bank's perspective, spike in people unable to repay their loans. So it's not obvious to me that they have loaned out of kilter with the risk profile. I got to say that, and I'll push back a little bit in a different way, and I'm probably not popular for saying this. I see little evidence that there's a huge number of loans that can't be repaid, but if there are loans that can't be repaid, why is it only the bank that took an irresponsible decision? Why isn't it the person borrowing who couldn't repay? Why aren't they also held accountable for them taking out a loan they couldn't repay? I mean, I assume they're an adult. I assume we're not giving too many of these loans to 14-year-old kids. And the bank is just full of workers who are also adults and shareholders who are also adults. And we should hold adults to a standard and hold them responsible for the decisions they make. So if banks end up lending money to people who can't repay it, the banks then should lose money subsequently. And if the banks lose money from bad decisions, they deserve to lose money and shouldn't be bailed out. That's my strong opinion. I'm very much against bank bailouts or any corporate bailouts. But if people make bad decisions, they also should be, to some degree, held responsible for the bad decisions they make. So there's my unpopular opinion.
There's a good book by David Barnson. I don't know if you know David at all. He's got a managed fund in the States. He's often on Fox Business. I've had him on my podcast. He's very good. He comes from a Christian perspective. His father was a preacher, well-known preacher in the States, and I'm not very religious, so I'm not. I don't have this. I don't necessarily share David's views, but his view is yes. We often blame the banks, the bankers, the people, the mortgage originators, but what about the people who took out these loans or borrowed the money and then just walked away? Because in the States, what is it? Are they non-recourse home loans?
They've got a thing they call in the US jingle mail, which is because if your house goes negative, then you just send the keys back to the bank.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. and so David was saying, well, look, where's the moral responsibility there on the, so he blames this general decline in morality. I'll have to try and I'm struggling to remember the name of the book, but maybe we can talk about it next week. But David's stuff's very good, and I mean he might be a good person for us to get on the show one time.
Yeah, I think that could be a good idea. I think we are at grave risk of getting into the territory of being two old men shouting kids these days. One last comment before I hand you the conch, Gene. Lyndon, spending several $1 billion on a redeveloped GABA for the Olympic venue is just bread and circuses and makes a negative effect on any true GDP. Look, I think that is a true assessment of the effectiveness of it. It will show up as a blip on GDP, but that is to some degree caused by simply the way you count GDP. So if a business spends money making something and nobody buys it, that doesn't sustainably show up in GDP. If a government, and also if they sell it at a discount, a private business, if they end up selling it at a discount, it shows up in GDP at a discount. For the government, if they spend a huge amount of money on a boondoggle, we simply count the input costs in GDP. So no matter how bad the government's spending, it shows up as a direct contribution to GDP. So when they originally redeveloped the GABA, that'll just be added straight onto the GDP statistics. So that's a bit cheeky. In terms of whether it's good for the economy long term, I very much doubt it. I think your underlying point is correct, Lyndon. There's a little bit of accounting wizardry that's going to make it look good for a moment. I think at that point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, John, that one of the things that will be helping the economy, will provide some resilience, is just all of the infrastructure spending that New South Wales and Victoria are undertaking, just massive amounts. So that will provide some offset. I think the point that Lyndon makes is a good one, and the point you made. I mean, it could provide a boost to your GDP in the short term, but if it's not in productive assets, then that's not good for your living standards in the long run, is it? It's not good for your productivity in the long run if you haven't invested in the right things.
Yeah, government investment can theoretically be good for the economy. Theoretically, the problem is in reality, they don't have a great track record at allocating that investment wisely, and they don't have a great track record at keeping the costs down. So you end up having cost overflows and pieces of infrastructure built primarily in marginal seats that need to be won at the next election, as opposed to places that have maximum need for infrastructure. But I will get off my soapbox there, and I will hand you the conch. I'll give you the bigger screen. And Gene, you wanted to talk to us today, I believe, about runaway rents in Australia. So take it away.
Oh, yes. Thanks, John, and thanks, everyone, for joining us. One thing that has just shocked me is just the extent of the problems we're seeing in the housing market and the rental market in particular. We're seeing hundreds of people turn up at open houses for rental properties. We're hearing stories of people being unable to get rental accommodation and living in tents, people living in cars. I mean, you go to the supermarket and you'll see someone parked next to you. They've got all their worldly possessions in the car. They're sleeping on the back seat. They've got a laundry basket on the passenger seat in the front with their clothes. It's just really depressing. And one bit of data that came out today, or that was highlighted by Leith Van Onselen at Macro Business in a really good article that he wrote. I was really impressed with this. Uncharted waters as hyperinflation hits rental market. And I mean, these are numbers from Louis Christopher at SQM Research. I mean, I'm not entirely sure I can't, how robust they are. I think he's certainly picking up the strong growth in rents. I've got no doubt about that. Whether it's 27.8% in the year to the 4th of March, I mean, that's a huge rate of growth. It's not quite hyperinflation. I mean, hyperinflation is when you've got inflation of 50% per month, I think, but it's a very high rate of inflation, and it just reflects just how difficult people are finding it in the rental market. And I mean, my take on it is that this is the result. It's the unintended consequence. And I think what we've seen, particularly since this the COVID and all the really arguably overreaction to COVID, what we've seen since then is all of these unintended consequences. And what's happened, I think, in the rental market is because we've had all of these people come back from overseas. We've had a lot of wealthy expats come back from overseas. They've come into Australia. They've bought properties. They've taken stock out of the rental market. And also, so that's one unintended consequence. Now, that's not just Australian government. That's governments all around the world. There was a general, panic, you could say, as Paul Freitas and Gigi Foster have called it, the Great COVID Panic. One consequence of that has been all of these people moving back. A lot of people came back to Australia, and because of remote work, we're all used to remote work now, they may not go back to where they were living. So I don't know what the numbers, I mean, there's several hundreds of thousands of people certainly came back to Australia. That's one part of the story. Another, and we had foreign students leave. They went back. They're starting to come back, and they're adding to the demand now for rental properties. So yeah, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that because of all of the additional borrowing that occurred during the pandemic, the very low interest rates, and at one time, so for several months, we had the amount of new money or new lending for owner-occupied housing, it was running about 2 times the level pre-pandemic. And this is just extraordinary. And this means that people who wouldn't have bought a property otherwise, suddenly they're getting into the market, they're moving out of home, and they're taking stock away from the rental market. Now, the other part of the story is something that is a lot longer. It's been a problem for a lot longer, and it's been causing this unintended consequence for a while now. And Melissa's made a good point on immigration. Yeah, that's coming back now. That's right. And this is one of the points that Leith makes in the article at the end, and I might read it because I think it's a really hard-hitting observation he makes there. That we've got, if you scroll down to it, John, maybe we'll go to it now. Basically what he argues is that, the Albanese government has picked the absolute worst time to ramp immigration to record levels. This is not necessarily... if there was another party in government, I'm sure we'd probably see similar increases in immigration, as both parties at different times have had very high rates of immigration. It's just that Albanese's in power now. Where will the hundreds of thousands of new migrants arriving live when there is already a critical shortage of housing for the current population? Labor is pouring immigration petrol on the rental bonfire, and the only logical outcome is further rent inflation and increased homelessness. Good point about immigration. Going back to the supply, what I was wanting to cover was this issue of supply. We're seeing the consequences of decades of restricting the development in parts of cities where people want to live, in inner cities primarily. We've restricted people from developing, in Brisbane, old Queenslanders. We're not getting the the medium density development that I think would be a real solution and provide good accommodation for people and help solve this this current problem that we've got. So yeah, that's basically my rant, John. I think we're seeing the unintended consequences of bad policies here in Australia and internationally.
Yes, indeed. Look, I think there's a couple of things to unpack here. One is, I think this is cold comfort for the people living through this situation, but there is an interesting economic, mystery to solve here about exactly what's caused this increase in demand, this noticeable increase in demand in the housing sector. I think part of it is, as you were saying, the low rates. I think part of it is probably also an increased aversion to risk at a time when people became more risk averse, right? I mean, they saw a lockdowns, they saw a pandemic, they saw other things going on, and they became more risk averse, and so they probably went back to assets they saw as lower risk. But there's several different potential explanations. As you say, it could have been the low rates, but that raises the question. We discussed about this a little before this episode started. That raises the question of, if people were buying a house because there were low rates, why weren't investors buying investment properties because there were low rates? Because, of course, if more investors were buying investment properties, that would be an increased supply of rental property. So that should have helped solve the problem, not exacerbate the problem. It seems that what's happened is there's been an increase of people buying houses to live in. And Gene, I think you noted this earlier in another context. There's been a decrease in the average size of households as people move out of the house to buy another house to live in. And because people are moving out of their house to buy another house to live in, and their average household size is shrinking, that's decreasing the number of houses on the rental supply, on the supply side of the rental market. So that's interesting questions, although I got to say that your end point is the crucial one. If we want to solve this, there's been an increase in demand for some reason. No matter what the reason, the only solution is build more houses. Right? That is, people complain about house prices are too high, build more houses. I can't find a place to live, build more houses. It's hard to get a rental property, build more houses. The rents are too high, build more houses. I mean, it always goes back to the same issue. People try to find overly complicated and overly smart, or perhaps smart-ass ways of interpreting this. The only sustainable solution to a shortage of housing is more houses. And that leads to another tricky economic problem, though. Why aren't these houses being built? And this is, you can say, all right, so the reason houses aren't being built is there's too much regulation slowing down the building of houses. There's too much strict zoning and planning laws slowing down the release of land. And this is all true. I think there's a more interesting institutional point behind that. Well, why is that happening, right? People are outraged. They want cheaper houses. Why isn't the government taking action? And the issue here is that the governments that are responsible for these zoning laws and these land release laws are the local and state governments. The government that benefits from development is the federal government. And the federal government has a strong incentive to try and get more houses built. And they often try to, both sides of politics. They take actions, they want to do that, but they don't control the land release. They don't control the zoning laws. And so we've got this mismatch of incentives where the levels of government that are responsible for releasing the land aren't the levels of government that benefit from development. And so I've suggested before in different contexts, and it doesn't have to be my way of doing it, but some sort of way of aligning those incentives where you can get local councils actually benefiting from the amount of development and the amount of people living in those local areas. That might help align the incentives and hopefully get those local councils and state governments to start releasing that land and relaxing the laws so we can get more houses built. And any solution that doesn't have more houses built is not a solution.
Yeah, exactly. John, could I add a few things that just occurred to me while you were speaking? So other things that have increased the demand for, they've added to the demand for rental accommodation at the same time as there have been factors restricting, reducing the supply as, those rental properties have been taken off the market because people are, buying them for owner occupation. Renovations, so they're all, cheap cheap money, and also I think there was a home builder scheme. Was there a scheme that encouraged or helped you get a renovation, provided some funding? I'm scratching my head to remember. There's so much in that COVID period. So there are people who are getting renovated. They're renovating, so they're adding to demand for rentals, and then there's also natural disasters. So people who've been displaced by flooding, they need rental accommodation. And then there's another factor that is taking accommodation away from long-term rentals. It's Airbnb, the short stay accommodation, and there are some people arguing that that's having an impact. And I mean, that's more in places that holiday locations, so Gold Coast, Sunny Coast, or Byron Bay, maybe in inner Brisbane to an extent. I'm still struggling to see how. I don't know how big an impact that will have. It'll definitely have some impact, but that's going to be a small fraction of the total rental properties that would be in short stay. So there are a few of the other factors. Regarding your point on why didn't people borrow money to buy investment properties, that's a good question. I guess, some would have, but perhaps it was because of the uncertainty in the economy. I mean, there was all this cheap money, and so people want housing to live in. They can see the benefit of that. Maybe investors were a bit more reluctant, but I'll have to go back and look at the data as to what happened with loans for investors. Certainly, loans for owner-occupiers surged massively.
Yeah, I have a few preliminary answers to my own question. I mean, there is now differential regulation and differential interest rates if you're a owner-occupier versus an investor. There does seem to be something of a low-key, that people overuse the idiom, war on something. So it's not a war on landlords, but it's been a low-key ongoing antipathy towards landlords, like they are the baddies. There was the Labor hinting at getting rid of negative gearing. I think now the abolition of negative gearing is kind of permanently in the back of people's minds. If you're going to tell investors that you're potentially going to make their investment less valuable in the future at a random time, whenever the political winds change, of course investors are less likely to do that. And what negative gearing does is it incentivizes people to buy houses to rent out. Exact thing we need, right? Everyone hates negative gearing, and they consider themselves trendy and cutting edge because they hate negative gearing. But that is a thing that incentivizes investors to buy houses to rent out, and that increases the supply of rental property. But there's also higher rates. The banks tend to charge higher rates. There is more regulation on lending money to investors rather than owner-occupiers. So that is all making it slightly less desirable vis-a-vis buying a house to live in. The other thing is the tenancy laws. This is probably a small issue as well, but the harder it is to remove a bad tenant, the more dangerous it is to invest in property as an investment, because things can easily go wrong if the tenants have all the control in that situation. If they can be a bad tenant and not leave and trash the place on the way out, then that's just an added risk that you have to factor into your willingness, right? Should I buy shares or should I buy an investment property? Well, given the tenants can trash my place, maybe I'll buy shares instead. That's one more investment property not on the market for a renter to rent. So that's another thing to consider. It's hard to disentangle which are the big drivers of all this. And of course, you're right, the switch to short-term accommodation through things like Airbnb is probably part of the puzzle. Again, very hard to disentangle the size. I think you're probably right that it's probably a small part of the puzzle, but it's a very visible one. So we shouldn't be surprised that some politicians have clung to it very strongly because that allows them to look busy. And if there's one thing politicians want to do, it's they want to look busy. They don't need to actually be busy. They don't need to fix the problem, but they need to look busy if they want to be re-elected. So there's been some political murmuring about the need to crack down on things like Airbnb in the hope that that will increase rental supply. But that's an example, as I said before. If your solution doesn't involve building more houses, then you're not actually talking about a solution. You're just talking about a way to try and get re-elected. So let's go back to this. How can we incentivize the creation of more houses in this country? Removing stamp duty on new property, I think, would be one simple step, but especially just loosening the planning and zoning laws on the periphery of cities and in regional towns, so to allow people to build that next suburb out, to allow people to get not only a place to live, but also hopefully a backyard. That's some of my answer on that. But I don't think we know exactly what's caused the increase in demand. It's an interesting economic question. Hopefully it'll be unpacked by future economic researchers. But whatever the answer, we know the solution is more supply. Thank you, James, for sticking around. Got some more comments coming in.
Good comments, John, particularly clarifications. People pointing out some of the policy measures that were relevant. So Melissa's pointed out that there was a federal 25K grant. Victoria had a 20K grant, I'm guessing that is, and waived stamp duty. So we've got, and then Sandy is going on about how there was the interest difference between, I guess that's owner occupied and investor, and there was a cap on the amount of investment loans banks had in their portfolio. Okay, so that's, I guess Sandy's suggesting, that meant that they were more likely to go owner occupied.
Yeah, this could be explaining the differential. I mean, there's theoretically speaking, if someone shifts from rental to owner occupier, yes, that's one less house on the market for renters, but there's also one fewer renter on the market because they're living in the house. But there's been something that incentivizes more buying of houses towards owner-occupier. That could help explain why we've got a decrease in the average house size as more people go into houses. Like they used to be sharing 4 people to a house. Maybe they're sharing 2 people to a house and split into 2 houses. And that could help potentially explain the new situation we're in. Andrew says investors were priced out by owner-occupiers. I mean, I think that's self-evidently what happened. The interesting economic question behind that is why? Why with low rates was it suddenly this way right now? Gene, you touched on a potential answer to this before, where you said a bunch of high net wealth Australians who were living overseas came back to Australia. They came back in. They wanted to buy a place to live. They would be able to then price out investors if they came back as high net wealth individuals. That could be an interesting part of the answer. And this is, like I said, this is the fun part of economics, where you have a puzzle and a mystery to unravel, and we've got to look for theoretically viable solutions. And then someone, maybe amongst our listening audience here, can go and do an economic master's by research or PhD and get to the bottom of it, compare all of these theories and find out which one is the actual culprit.
And psychology was part of it too, John. I mean, if you think about the people who are buying the houses or the apartments for owner occupation, fear of missing out is going to be more relevant to them than investors, isn't it? So there's a lot of fear of missing out, and people just went nuts, and all the cheap money that we better get into the market. This is our time to get into the market, and prices just really skyrocketed, and what that in the prices probably they went up, but the investors might have been, maybe they were less driven by psychology, more the rational calculators, and therefore they were less likely to buy at that stage. And that's that point that Andrew makes: investors were priced out by owner occupiers. So it could be the impact, the influence of psychology, that fear of missing out for owner occupiers.
Yeah, you find that fear of missing out, the FOMO also impacts investors, although the differential there, the other thing you have to factor in, the difference between the investors and the owner-occupiers, is the owner-occupiers have the consumption value of the housing. And so if there's a change in that consumption value, or a change in the relative importance of the consumption value, that could also shift a switch in behavior between owner-occupiers and investors. So there's lots of viable theories on the table here. I don't think many of these theories could be, sorry, go ahead.
I was just wondering, are you alluding to the fact that the pandemic meant that the consumption value of the house increased, and that could be part of the explanation? Because we can work, with remote work, and also if people are if we're worried about, viruses, we want to spend more time at home. So the value of having a home that we're happy in, our own home, I'm just wondering, I'm just trying to think this through, whether that could be a factor, the pandemic.
No, I've definitely seen people suggest that as part of the puzzle, as part of the issue. The increase in work from home has meant that your house now is relatively more important in your consumption bundle because you spend a greater percentage of your time there. Therefore, you're willing to invest a higher amount of money in the consumption value of your house. I've seen that. And there's also just the issue of a relative change in the return on housing just changes the relative importance of the consumption value of your house vis-a-vis the investment driver of the reason to buy a house. So there could be multiple things going on. The fun thing about this, look, it's sad to say, it's perhaps inappropriate of me to talk about the fun part of this discussion. It really is a dire situation. The housing situation in Australia has gotten well beyond a joke, and it really is something where eventually a politician is going to have to decide that doing the right thing is more important than getting re-elected, I hope. But putting that aside from an economic perspective, one of the reasons I like economics is you get these mysteries, and then part of the response is to try and work out what is an internally coherent, logical, theoretically sound explanation for it. And we've discussed several of them in this conversation. Some of them just lead to more questions. That's an unsatisfying answer. But some of these things are theoretically could be the reason. And then we need to unpack the data and find out which one of these reasons are bigger drivers.
Just on the politicians and how they'll respond, and the risk is that they will respond by doing something that they will argue this is solving the problem, but really isn't solving the problem and is actually and could have its own unintended consequences. I mean, what populist politicians could end up proposing are things like rent caps or rent what do you call it, the rent ceilings,
rent caps. We had a comment in here from Melissa earlier actually saying that the Victorian Greens want to cap rents. Price controls on rent controls. It's a common suggestion. It's a commonly used example in economics because it's one of the most guaranteed outcomes that when you introduce rent controls, you create a much worse situation than you had before. And again, it's an example of if your solution doesn't involve building more houses, your solution is not a solution. It's just a re-election strategy. And price caps, rental caps is an example of that. What that does is it just further decreases the incentive for people to buy investment properties and therefore further decreases the supply of rental property. The problem we have here is there's not enough houses that exist for renters to rent. And the Greens' solution is to ensure that there are even fewer houses available for renters to rent. And some lucky few get to rent them at a low price and everyone else just gets to entirely miss out, which is a terrible non-solution. At this point in time, the amount of data available showing that price caps and rent don't work is so overwhelming that it's hard to believe they would be coming up with this solution with anything other than naked political interests and disregard for actual humans.
Yeah. And some of the other things we'll see, I mean, we're already starting to see this push for social housing, but they're never going to be able to build enough houses, and there are problems with government owning the housing stock, and there are also the issues with public housing. It's difficult to make it work, so that's not really a solution. And the other thing we'll probably see is bans. There'll be calls for bans on the short stay accommodation. You won't be allowed to let out your property for, you won't be able to have Airbnb in your property. And I mean, that's a restriction on people's freedom. And I mean, I think that's probably a bit excessive, and it probably won't solve the problem either. I mean, my view is that we've just restricted the housing development for too long in places where people want it. I mean, I've been on the news. I was campaigning for them to redevelop that Paddington Workers Club site. I drive past it all the time on the corner of Given Terrace and Latrobe Terrace. I was there saying that this is a great thing. I told them on the news, but there were friends of mine down in Paddington saying, "Oh no, this is terrible. This will destroy the neighbourhood." But look, you need to have it if we're going to have people living in accommodation in cities where there are jobs, and it's good from an environmental perspective too to have people living close to the city. So there are all sorts of benefits, and we just need to have more supply.
Yeah, look, I'm going to push back a little. I think you're fundamentally correct. A couple of things. One is the Airbnb probably is contributing to the decrease in supply. I think it's probably a small issue, but it is there. I think we're better served to admit that. There's definitely going to be political incentives for politicians to then try to crack down on Airbnb to try and get themselves that populist re-election boost. The thing we need to consider there is what's that going to hurt elsewhere. That's going to create increased demand for something else. I mean, the people renting out Airbnb are people. They're there for a reason. What are they going to do instead? So it would be interesting to unpack some of the unintended consequences of that. But look, I think that's a rounding error. I think that's a political football to help politicians. I don't think it's going to make a big difference. You mentioned earlier, look, I think you're fundamentally right. I don't think social housing is the solution, but it is the least dumb idea coming from the left, if I can put it that way, right? So I worry that if you as Friedman said, if you put the government in charge of the Sahara Desert, within a few years, they'd run out of sand, right? I mean, they're not good at running things. So I don't trust them. But at least I've said before several times in this conversation and many times before that if your solution isn't about supply, it's not a solution. At least to the credit of the people who want that social housing, at least that answer is about supply, right? I worry that they'll build the wrong homes. They'll build them inefficiently. They'll build bad homes. They'll build them overpriced. They'll build them in the wrong places. All of the things you get when a bureaucrat runs it. But at least there would be a house at the end. So that is a less dumb solution than price caps. Right? So that's I will give them that. At least there would be an extra house in existence. And look, at the end of the day, we need more houses in existence. I'd much prefer them to improve the incentive for developers to get out so that not only do we have more houses, we have the right houses well built at a cheap price in the right area. But whatever we do, at some stage, there just needs to be more houses. I mean, there just needs to be more houses. We've got a solution coming in here from Tim. I haven't read it yet, but I know Tim. He's a smart man. So let's see. My solution is aggressive. Feds hold back percentage of GDP until supply zoning is fixed. Oh, I like that. This goes to my point about the incentive misalignment between the different areas of government. And how do we get the state and local governments to take this issue as seriously as the feds are incentivized to take it? I like it. I don't think anyone will go for it, Tim, but I like it. A few more comments coming in here. Perhaps part of the rental issue is the increased amount of baby boomers increasingly reaching retirement age. I'm not sure how that, are you saying that could contribute to lower average household sizes? Because I'm not sure how that would change the availability of houses. I mean, that could actually mean baby boomers go off to retirement homes and that increases the supply of housing. So I'm 50-50 on that, Lyndon, unless you can explain to me, unless you can unpack that a little more. Melissa, my sister has a holiday house. They Airbnb it for some extra cash. If they can't, they just won't rent it out at all. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. It's a simplistically appealing argument, especially from the left, to say Airbnb has done this, right? Airbnb has meant people aren't renting their houses out, they're Airbnb-ing them. But a lot of people are Airbnb-ing, that's a weird verb, houses that wouldn't otherwise be on the rental market. And by putting them out as Airbnb, they're actually providing an additional place where people can stay sometimes.
Yeah.
Right. So then where would those people stay otherwise? Maybe they just wouldn't go on trips. Maybe they would stay in hotels, increasing the demand for hotels, pushing up the prices of hotels. The let's crack down on Airbnb brigade, really, it's incumbent upon them to really unpack the unintended consequences of their pitch, because I don't think it's going to achieve much, but it is going to hurt people unintended on the side, as so many public policies do. Did you have anything more on this one, Gene? I think we're just about to wrap up.
No. I think this has been great, John, and lots of good comments and clarifications and information from the audience. So yeah, I think it's great, and yeah, giving me a lot to think about.
Well, and this means we're coming up to the hour mark, so we're actually going to be able to wrap this up within an hour if I finish what I have to say in the next 20 seconds. So thank you everyone for joining us. We do this every week, well, most weeks, but nearly every Tuesday, 7 p.m. Queensland time, 8 p.m. New South Wales and Victoria. Other states, choose your own adventure. You can find us on the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, The Good Source, and my personal YouTube and Facebook page, me being John Humphreys, my co-host being Gene Tunny. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Hey DJ, what do you think of the budget?
Budget naughty.
Yeah, budget naughty.